This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is Thanksgiving time, 1979. The class of 1983 at Annapolis is gathered to cheer on Navy over Army. I welcome a member of the class of 83, remembering that cold November day, Thomas Moodley. His new book about his time in the Navy, both as a midshipman, serving aviator, and later an official at the DoD, is entitled Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the bridge of the U.S. Navy. Tom, you were a young man in 1979. Can you remember that game? What was it like to be a member of all those wonderful young people?
Well, thank you, John, for having me on to talk about the book and to talk about my experiences. 79 was very memorable for me. I had grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, and decided to go to the Naval Academy. At that particular point in our nation's history, it wasn't one of the most popular things to be doing. We were still in somewhat of a Vietnam hangover to some extent in certain parts of the country, and so was very honored to be selected to go there, and always look forward to attending that first Army Navy game. When we get there as plebes, that first plebe summer, they teach us 4 important phrases. The first one is yes, sir, then no, sir, and then no excuse, sir. And then the final one is beat Army, sir. And everything that you do as a plebe drives towards that important game that comes in November. Now it comes in December, but at that time it used to come in November around Thanksgiving weekend. And so it's an incredibly important event, I think, in the evolution of your time as a midshipman, because it's really the first time you feel like you're part of something much, much bigger than yourself. And I remember marching into that stadium along with 4,000 or so other midshipmen and standing there and doing the hat trick that we do at the beginning of the game, and just watching that game that had been played for so many decades before, and just really getting an appreciation for what I had become a part of. And it always stuck with me, and it was just a wonderful experience. And of course, Navy won the game, running away that particular game. So it was fun in every dimension.
Your mom and dad are from a part of the world that's now in a conflict zone again. It was the Cold War in 1979. We don't know what it's called today, Tom. Where's mom from? Where's dad from?
Sure. My mother was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and spent most of her time in Novi Sad. Her mother passed away early, and she had to live in an orphanage with her sister, and her father was then sent off into the German army. So she had a very difficult childhood. There was a big massacre in Novi Sad in 1942, I believe, where people who were suspected of being sympathizers with the opposition to the German army were taken and massacred along the river there in the Danube. And then my father grew up just up the Danube River in Budapest, Hungary. And he escaped after the war in 1948, went to Austria and lived there for a couple of years, and then was able to get passage to the United States. They both settled in Cleveland, Ohio, and they met at an international Hungarian ball in Cleveland, Ohio in 1956.
Your classmates from 1983 went in all directions, surface, submarine. You were an aviator. Where did you do your tours, Tom?
So I immediately after graduation from the academy, I stayed in Washington and did a master's degree at Georgetown in international relations and government, and then joined many of my classmates down in Pensacola, Florida, where I went through flight training for the next year and a half, and then was assigned to an LHA, amphibious assault ship in Norfolk, Virginia, where I flew the ship's company helicopter, UH-1 November helicopter, for a tour. And then because of the master's degree I had, I was selected to go teach at the Air Force Academy as an exchange professor there in their political science department. So I did that for my final years of active duty.
We now move to the 21st century. We leave your 20th century memories behind, Tom. In the 21st century, you are with the Donald Rumsfeld Department of Defense in the early conflict zone that we remember as the War on Terror. What do you remember about Don Rumsfeld? You were Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for financial, well, I wrote down fintech, forgive me.
Yes, financial management. He was one of the deputy undersecretaries under the comptroller or the CFO of the Department of Defense. I'd come in originally as the executive director of something called the Defense Business Board, which was a board Secretary Rumsfeld established, where he brought in CEOs, private sector CEOs and senior executives from around the country to advise him on this business transformation mission that he was on. That was really the mandate he had coming into the department, was to try and reform and modernize it, given his experience as a private sector CEO. But all that changed, all those priorities changed on September 11th when we were attacked, and the nation and the department basically mobilized to propagate the global war on terror under his leadership from the Department of Defense. However, he continued to cling to the idea that we needed to drive this business reform, and so I was tapped to help do that work.
And you got two important lessons. I wrote them down, Tom. One is you go to war with the army you got, not the army you should have. And the other one, Tom, you can't fix government. What does that refer to, Tom?
Well, that was a familiar mantra. The second one was a familiar mantra that I would hear from people. We were really trying to push the organization to adopt more modern business practices, more modern business systems, improve transparency, be able to get an audit so we'd actually know where the money was going that was being fed to us by the U.S. taxpayers. And there are a lot of systemic things in the department that make it very difficult to drive change like that. And we would frequently hear that phrase, like, Tom, you can't fix government, or you can't fix this, and so it was always, to me, it was never discouraging. It was all just kind of like, well, that's just said by people who don't want to try. So we continue to try and push it, and made some decent progress in that dimension. The other quote, Secretary Rumsfeld said that because there were questions about how well the war was going, whether or not we had the right equipment there. This is the Iraq War, and he said, "Hey, look, we go to war with the army we have, not the army we wish we had." And it's true. I think people took that as a sort of sarcastic criticism of the state of the army or of the military in general, but it's very, very true, because you only have what you have, and if you're thinking about the world through certain paradigms, you're going to build what you think you need for that. But my argument was, when I returned later, was that the paradigm we should be thinking about is unpredictability. And so that, I believe, suggests a very different type of force that's much more agile, much more mobile, much more flexible, responsive, et cetera. And I think he believed that too back then. But things have a way, or events have a way of taking over the agenda. And when the terrorist attacks happened, he really got focused on that, and so some of those efforts sort of died on the vine.
Your professional life then included Price Waterhouse until 2017, when the Navy suffers two tragedies: the Fitzgerald collision and the McCain collision. At the same time, you are under consideration to be Undersecretary of the Navy. You got a phone call from the Trump administration. Are you interested?
Yes. Yes. Thanks, John. So initially I was not interested. I really had not been active in politics, but I did start hearing some things in the early part of 2017 that they were having a hard time finding people, because several very prominent national security specialists had signed this Never Trump letter. And of course, the president was not anxious to bring any of those people onto his staff. But in a normal change of administration to a Republican administration, those people would have been some of the most aggressive at trying to get jobs. And I was not interested in being aggressive to try and get one of those jobs. I liked the job I had and felt like I could continue to do that for several more years. But I did receive a call from the White House Personnel Office in the Pentagon, and they asked me if I was interested. And I told them bluntly that I was, but only if a couple of jobs were available. And one of them was the Undersecretary of the Navy. And so it was offered, and I accepted. I
mentioned the McCain and Fitzgerald because that represents the challenge to anybody going into the Navy secretaryship these days, is that the fleet is overextended and not strong enough to do all the missions it must in order to maintain freedom of the seas. And we will address that now, because in late 2019, Tom gets another call. The Secretary of the Navy has left his post, Mr. Spencer, And that means Tom is going to be acting Secretary of the Navy. And when we come back, what does that mean as we end 2019 and move into 2020? China threat, pandemic threat. The book is Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the Bridge of the U.S. Navy. Thomas B. Modley is the author. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor with Tom Modley. His new book is Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the Bridge of the USS Navy. Tom is now acting Secretary of the Navy, an esteemed post with challenges in all directions, and all we can do is mention a few of them. First, what is 355 plus, Tom? What did that mean then?
Yes, well, in 2016, the Navy commissioned 3 different studies to look at what the future force structure should look like. How many aircraft carriers, how many destroyers, how many frigates, et cetera, what that mix would look like and how many they should have or set as a North Star to try and achieve. At that particular time, we had about 275 ships. That had been a significant decline from the 600 ship Navy under President Reagan and Secretary Lehman. And we were looking at a threat environment that was becoming far more complex and challenging with the Chinese Navy and others threatening ours. So they did these studies and they focused in on one that suggested that the best force mix was 355 ships. And so that then became part of where they were trying to head. It didn't become official policy until President Trump ran for election, and he claimed it and said that he was going to drive towards this 350 ship Navy. And the Congress put it in law that was the goal for the nation. So that's where the 355 comes from. When I was sworn in as undersecretary, I gave a speech at the Naval Academy and talked about how we need to think about that more in terms of 355 plus, because it was not just those traditional hulls, but it was the entire environment that we need to be thinking about investing in. So those traditional 350 or more ships, but unmanned vessels, the whole cyber connectivity, integration with other unmanned systems and aerial systems. And so I started calling it 355 plus, because I really didn't think the number was that important, other than to suggest that we're at 275 now and we got a long way to go to where we need to go, and to start putting a marker out there that we needed to invest in that to start driving towards it.
A second challenge, and you and I talked about this at the time, Tom, was education and sea power. How do they go together?
Well, one of the major challenges, and one of the things I really started looking at, and I come to it with a bias, having spent some time in academia and as well as in consulting, and understanding how important it is to have people with the intellectual capacity to think about circumstances in a much more flexible way. And what I had noticed in coming in and evaluating the education systems in the Navy is that they hadn't really evaluated that as a holistic thing for over 100 years. There was something in 1918 called the Knox-King-Pyle Report, which basically reimagined naval education. And those reforms were critical to helping prepare the senior officers that we had for the battles they were going to face in World War II. And I felt that we needed to look at it, given the changing environment, a movement towards maybe perhaps a less kinetic age to a more cognitive age, where we have cyber issues and advanced artificial intelligence and unpredictability, that we needed to rethink our education system. So I commissioned a study called Education for Sea Power, and I took my hands off it and let them run. And I brought in some very senior people from both sides of the aisle to take a look at this. And they made a lot of strong recommendations for how we should realign naval education to prioritize it, that intellectual development of our sailors and Marines to better prepare them for this century.
That's where we first met, Tom, thanks to your colleagues, your staff. Bob Love and Steve Deal brought me in to understand. You divided the world up into gray hulls, gray matter, and gray zone. What is a gray zone, Tom?
A gray zone to me, I mean, I know it sounds very, mysterious, like something you'd see in a spy movie or something. And I know there's gray zone operations where people go behind enemy lines to do things. But what I thought about gray zones, when I thought about gray zones, I was talking about all those back office things that happen in the department that facilitate the execution of the Navy's mission. So it's the financial management, the supply chain stuff, the human capital strategies, all those things that people tend to not look at or take seriously or don't get as much priority as buying a missile or a ship or an aircraft. And so I called those gray zones. And gray matter obviously was an intellectual development piece of it. And then the gray hulls was all about defining what that force structure needed to be so that we could start going after it. And those were my three priorities as the acting secretary of the Navy.
My note says there's $210 billion annual in the Defense Department budget for the Navy, 75% of which is the Navy's, 25% is the Marine Corps'. That's a great deal of money, except what is the Etzel Ford?
Well, the Ford, that's my sort of pejorative name for the Ford, and I do it tongue in cheek because I really think the ship is going to be a fabulous warship when it's complete. But I called it the Etzel in my book because in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, it got the attention of the president. It was the first in the new generation of aircraft carriers. It was to be built on the Nimitz class hull, which was sort of the bulwark of our supercarrier fleet. But it had been redesigned, and something like 21 or more new technologies were integrated into this new hull. They were having a lot of trouble, particularly with the electromagnetic launch systems and the electromagnetic elevators for weapons. And it had kind of become, I guess, a whipping boy for the president in terms of everything that the Navy couldn't do right. The ship started out as a $9 billion projected cost. By 2017, it was estimated it was going to come in at like $13 billion, which is a significant cost overrun. And it was just overwhelmed, I think, by complexity with trying to integrate all these things at once. However, the design of the ship was really for the future. The electromagnetics allow you to basically man these stations on the ship with 30 to 40% fewer people. And so you're putting less people in harm's way. The cost of those people goes away. Things like that are very, very, I think, very cleverly designed into the Ford itself. But I call it the Etzel because the Etzel, if you know the story of the Etzel in the 1950s, it was a new vehicle that was being developed. I believe it was Henry Ford the third or the second who wanted to create this new revolutionary vehicle. It had all kinds of things like a push button transmission, and it was just ahead of its time and too expensive, and the population just didn't adapt to it. And what I was trying to get our people to understand is that we can't have something called the USS Etzel Ford. This aircraft carrier is going to be at the front lines of our defense and our naval power, and we needed to get it right, and we needed to fix all the problems that we had. And so I tried to get everybody, all hands on deck, to try and fix that, and frankly, get it off the president's radar so we could deliver what we needed to deliver for the American people.
And the Ford, we have 30 seconds. Where's the Ford right now, Tom?
I'm pretty sure the Ford is out on deployment right now, but I don't know. They're based in Norfolk, Virginia.
Tom Moodley, Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the bridge of the U.S. Navy. It is now the winter of 2020. When we come back, the pandemic hits the Navy. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor with Tom Moodley. His new book, Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the bridge of the U.S. Navy. Tom Moodley, from his first moments as a member of the U.S. Navy, and when he was 1979 at the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. And now we come to the most difficult moments, to my knowledge, the United States has ever lived through. The pandemic called COVID-19. It is the winter of 2020. Tom has been rewarded for all of his years of hard work with being the acting Secretary of the Navy in an unknown challenge of what do you do about a virus that we believe is dangerous, but we're not getting good information from the People's Republic of China. The important detail here are the people around Tom as acting secretary. He has a great deal of power. He's a civilian. And that, in our understanding, means that you have a deal of authority with the uniforms. It's important to see who else he's serving with. The Secretary of Defense at this time is Mark Esper. Who is he, Tom, and where does he come from?
Mark Esper is a graduate of West Point, class of '86. He's a classmate, actually, of Secretary Mike Pompeo, both class of '86 guys from West Point. When I came to the Pentagon, and this second time around, he was the Secretary of the Army, and he was selected to become the Secretary of Defense when the original selection that President Trump had selected, Secretary Shanahan, decided to withdraw his name from consideration. And so Secretary Esper was the next man up.
And Admiral Gilday, who is he? Where does he come from?
Mike Gilday is class of '85 from the Naval Academy. And it's a consistent theme. There are a lot of people around the Pentagon during my tenure who were either at West Point or at Annapolis the same time I was there as a midshipman. But Mike is class of '85, so he would have been a sophomore when I was a senior at the Naval Academy. He was the 10th Fleet Commander, which was the U.S. Naval Cyber Command. And he had been selected to be the CNO after Bill Moran, who was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, had to withdraw his name from consideration due to a situation that had to do with him maintaining contact with a previous naval officer who had had some problems with sexual harassment.
And General Berger, who is he? Where does he come from?
General Berger was a previous 3-star general, and he was selected from a rank of probably 3 or 4 very, very qualified lieutenant generals to be the commandant of the Marine Corps.
We're looking at the decision makers in uniform and out of uniform, because what is about to happen, no one had an understanding. In January, February of 2020, to recover, there is information that something is awry in China. The fleet is deployed. And we go now to what Tom and his colleagues knew at the time, this February-March period. What was your information about the scale of this, Tom, and what were you and your colleagues talking about doing?
Well, almost immediately into the beginning of this, we started having meetings with the senior leadership of the department to talk about COVID and what it might mean, and developing procedures for how we can deal with an outbreak on ships or at installations. And then we were also called into action because as there were cruise ship members who were stranded off the coast of California that needed to be put into quarantine, and there really wasn't anywhere to put them.
That was the middle of February, very early. Go ahead.
Yes. And so they came to the Department of Defense to see if we could help. And of course, we were able to create some living space to use as quarantine for a couple of weeks for these people. But the effort to me was a complete mismatch with respect to the perspective scale of this. It was fine. We were able to do it. But that was for like a few thousand people at the most. And this, obviously, the way this virus was starting to spread across, I was particularly looking at Italy, as Italy really was spreading around Italy. And Italy's a society like ours. It's fairly open, and people travel around. And I felt like there really was going to be, it was going to be very difficult for us to control the spread of this across the country. And if they're going to come to the military looking for help, we really didn't have an answer at that particular time.
February 29th, my note says, is the first COVID death of an American citizen. So this is very early on. You have 2 hospital ships, Mercy and Comfort. You deployed them to where?
Well, it was interesting. It's an interesting story because at the beginning of, I believe it was in the beginning to early part of February, after I had first heard some information about what was happening in Wuhan, I asked the Navy if we could have these ships ready in case, we needed to use them if this became a national emergency. And I was told that the Mercy was available, but the Comfort was going to be in maintenance for the next 6 to 9 months and wasn't going to be available. And that wasn't a very satisfying answer to me, but we sort of put it on hold. And then it became apparent as the virus started to spread that perhaps these ships could be used to help by bringing them into the biggest population centers where they could relieve the hospital system from some of the beds mostly for trauma victims, because these hospital systems were being overwhelmed with COVID patients. So that was the plan. The Comfort was to go to New York City, which it did. And then the Mercy was to go from San Diego up to Los Angeles to Long Beach.
March 5th, the USS Teddy Roosevelt makes a port call, an important political port call, geopolitical port call in Da Nang. March 14th, the Teddy Roosevelt at sea reports 39 crew members positive for COVID-19. March 27th, Friday, March 27th, the TR reaches Guam. What is the challenge for an aircraft carrier with COVID cases on board? What did you know then, Tom?
Well, the biggest challenge was how do we control this spread, and particularly how do we control it if crew members are really getting sick and to the point where they're critical and need to be put into respirators and things like that, or ventilators. And we weren't really sure if that was going to happen. The problem with the carrier is you have about 4,500 people on it, and it's pretty contained, and the ventilation systems just pretty much pump air around the entire ship. So it's a difficult environment to try and control something like that. So what we thought we would do, and there were several different plans in place in terms of where to bring them, and that, as we were all sort of learning on the fly on this, but the decision was made to send the ship to Guam and quickly get 6 sailors off, and then also establish a watch rotation so we could have the right skills off, make sure that they were clean of the virus, bring them back on, so that we get the ship back out to sea and on station as quickly as possible.
The events tumble. For example, there is a CNN call that a member of Tom Modly's staff is ill with COVID-19. That is not confirmed, but in any event, phone calls are flying back and forth. Your staff is working very hard to get in charge of this. And then the surprise. I said the TR reached Guam on the 27th. On the 29th, Sunday, I believe, the San Francisco Chronicle publishes a letter from the captain of the TR. What does the letter say?
Well, just to reset the time frame. So on Sunday, the ship got there on the 27th, and on Sunday, and on that Friday, I believe I told Bob Love, my chief of staff, that I really think it would be good for us to go to Guam and make sure that they were getting everything they needed on shore to facilitate this, and make sure they understood that Washington sort of had their back on this whole thing. The governor of Guam had been in my office about 2 weeks prior to that, and I felt I had a good relationship with her and could go talk to her about how she might be able to assist in the efforts. And so Bob reached out to the captain, the commanding officer of the ship, on that Sunday and told him of our interest in coming. And he suggested that we don't come. He felt like it would be a distraction at that particular time. And then the best we can piece together the time frame, a few hours later, he sent out a letter that he sent over unsecured channels. And it was addressed only to naval aviators. It bypassed his direct fleet commander, the 7th Fleet Commander, Admiral Bill Merz, and just basically painted a very dire set of circumstances on shore, and sort of gave the impression that people weren't listening or paying attention, which couldn't have been farther from the truth. On Guam, they had mobilized like 900 people to develop this very, very sophisticated process to get the sailors off, to feed them, etc. They were working on securing hotel rooms at the 4- and 5-star hotels in Guam with the governor. And then this letter somehow, and I still don't know to this day, and I asked Captain Crozier about this later, we don't know how it got leaked, but it got leaked because it was not sent over secure channels. So once you send something like that over non-secure channels, it's available for everybody. And I believe there was a sense of panic on the ship, and maybe somebody who got it or forwarded it to somebody else, and then it made its way to the San Francisco Chronicle. And as we were flying out to greet the Mercy on its way from from San Diego to Los Angeles, this letter hit the news. This was on Tuesday. This letter hit the news, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I was just surprised, and I called Bob and said, "Didn't you just talk to the captain?" And he said he had, and he'd also talked to him a day later and said everything sounded fine. So it just took us all by surprise. And I knew that the environment at that moment had changed, and this was going to be a profound event.
Meetings in the Pentagon all week. All the major officers' names we know, General Milley, Admiral Gilday, Secretary Asper, everybody's involved. They're all consulting with each other. And all of this to be unpacked, but I want, Tom, for you to recall for us now, your decision to go to the TR and speak to the crew after the captain had been relieved.
Yes, well, I relieved the captain on Thursday, and that was basically after a conversation I had with the strike group commander, who was a rear admiral on the ship. And I asked him point blank, had the captain talked to him about this letter? And he said that he hadn't, that he saw it when it turned up in his inbox. And I said, did you challenge him on this? And he said he did, and that the captain responded that the reason he did not talk to him about it in advance was because he knew that the strike group commander would not allow that communication to go out from the ship. And so at that moment, I realized he was intentionally and premeditatively insubordinate to his commander. And I decided that he was just not making good decisions. The ship was in a crisis, and we needed to have a steadier hand on board the ship. So that's what happened there. But what I didn't, and I announced this in a press conference, and I completely underestimated the public reaction to this. And it became very, very ugly in a lot of different ways for me. And on Friday, we found out that the captain had COVID. So he was now an even more sympathetic figure to those of whom had sympathy for him. And then he left the ship to a rousing pep rally that was broadcast or sent to NBC News, and was broadcast all over the place. And no one was socially separated, no one wearing masks. And so I came to the decision that I needed to go to Guam for a couple of reasons. One was I just needed to talk to the crew and help them understand the reasons why I relieved their CO and what their mission was and duty. And then I also felt like I needed to make sure that everything that I had been saying about what was going on shore to take care of them was actually happening.
The book is Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the Bridge of the U.S. Navy. Tom Modley is the author. When we come back, Tom Modley addresses the crew of the Teddy Roosevelt in the days when we knew very little about the dimensions and the risk of the pandemic, but America was frightened. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor with Tom Modley. His new book is Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the Bridge of the U.S. Navy. Tom has now flown to Guam to address the crew of the Teddy Roosevelt, whose captain has left the ship. There is panic in the nation. It is a time when we had very poor information about the pandemic. What we know now is that the young men and women on board TR were very unlikely to be damaged severely by the virus. That's reserved for an older age group and people with pre-existing conditions, not healthy young sailors. But nobody knew that at the time, including Tom, who's taking a great risk to travel to Guam, but that was the nature of his job. What did you say to the sailors, and how did they hear you, Tom?
Well, I think a couple of missteps on my part. First of all, when we got to Guam, I told my team that, and I very much low-keyed the trip. I told people I don't want any public affairs. I don't want any press. Just going to be me and my military aide and my chief of staff, and that's pretty much it. We got there, and my NCIS protection team told me that they were not going to allow me to go on the ship. And I said, why is that? There's 3,000 Navy sailors on there. I need to go. And they basically said, well, sir, we're responsible for your safety, and it's a COVID environment, and so on and so forth. So I said, well, I'm going on the ship, so you guys need to come up with a compromise. So they said, well, we'll escort you to a clean room. And remember, these were the days where, you'd bleach down everything to make sure it was clean and there was no, virus specks flying around. And so they said that they would escort me to a clean room and allow me to speak to them over the 1MC, which is a shipboard loudspeaking system. It was not ideal, but it was still something that I wanted to do. So I asked for the ship to provide me with some questions in advance so that I could answer them during my remarks to them. because I didn't want it to be a one-way communication. So as we're driving down to the ship, Bob Love, my chief of staff, handed me this folder with 33 questions in it. And he said, I don't think you should read these right now. And I said, why not? And he said, you're just not going to like them. And the tone of them, some of them were respectful, some of them were not. But it suggested to me that the leadership of the ship had not done a good job sort of laying out what was going on. And the biggest question that caused me pause was one that said, "Sir, how many dead sailors on the TR would be acceptable to you before you got us some help getting off the ship?" And it just suggested to me that they had no idea what was going on shore, the massive effort, the mobilization, the fact that people in Washington actually did care and were engaged. And so when I walked up to talk to them, after talking to the senior officers from behind masks, I just didn't get a good sense. I wasn't emotionally in tune with how people were actually feeling. And I just started talking extemporaneously about their mission, why I relieved the captain, how I felt that he had done things that were not what we expect from captains of aircraft carriers. Some of the words were manipulated by the media and misinterpreted by people, but that's totally on me for not being clear about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it.
Lessons learned, Tom. 3 years later, we've learned a great deal about the virus and about how we conducted ourselves everywhere, not just in the Navy, but outside. You have 10 lessons learned at the close of your book. They're all extremely important. When emotions are raw, particularly your own, empathize more and lecture less. I believe you just gave us that example.
Yes, for sure.
When explaining difficult decisions, take off the mask and look people in the eye. I think you just gave us that explanation.
Yes, that's a metaphor, obviously, but I think it was very true when I was talking to the senior members of the crew, and we were all sitting there with masks. I think we even had rubber gloves on our hands, and you just can't get a sense for how people are thinking. You can look them in the eye, but the understanding how they're thinking and I think their willingness to talk from behind those masks were inhibited. And frankly, none of them offered anything. They didn't. I asked them for input or what I should say to the crew, and none of them said anything. They just sort of shook their heads. And I could tell that they were fatigued and tired of the whole situation, which was understandable.
If an unpopular decision has to be made, make it. Don't ask someone else to make it for you, which is really tough advice in an environment like that.
Yes. Well, I think, John, just to elaborate on that, when I spoke to it's really the strike group's commander's responsibility to relieve the person that's working for him. But by the time I had spoken to him, this whole thing had turned into a political kerfuffle. And I wasn't really willing to put a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, even a 4-star in the middle of that. I was a political person, political appointee on a limited tenure, and I figured that it was my responsibility to make the decision. And if there was a lot of heat, then I would take it.
And finally, number 1, when in charge, act like it. Don't pretend.
Exactly. I mean, this was just sort of the mantra that I had as the acting secretary. The acting secretary has basically all the authorities of the Secretary of the Navy. And so I was determined during my time as acting secretary to use that time to advance the things that I thought were important for the Navy. I had someone had told me that the average tenure of an acting secretary was 110 days. So I came up with 11 top 10 lists of the 110 things I wanted to accomplish during that 110 days. And we just set about ticking them off and accomplishing them. And so to me, it's never a good idea to just keep the seat warm. There was enough uncertainty about whether Ambassador Braithwaite, who had been nominated by the president to replace me, would ever get a hearing. And so I wasn't going to waste the time. The Navy needed to move out and advance its objectives for the next century. And I really wanted to help them do that.
Tom Motley is the author. Vectors is the book. The illustrations are by Christopher D. Filippo. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.